There is a man who died almost 800 years ago, yet today, nearly 16 million men carry his DNA. This isn't a myth. It is the genetic footprint of a conqueror who didn't just win battles, he rewrote the human story with a sword. That man was Genghis Khan, and the armies he forged were a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. Genghis Khan's armies built the largest contiguous land empire in history. But their greatest weapon wasn't the sword, it was the mind. They used a system of calculated terror to psychologically shatter their enemies, winning wars before the real fighting even began. We're about to break down 5 of his most brutal rules, from weaponized starvation to the chilling use of human shields. This is how fear conquered the world. Rule 1: The illusion of mercy, the reality of annihilation. The Mongol art of war was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and it all started with a simple, terrifying offer: surrender or die. This ultimatum wasn't just a threat, it was the cornerstone of their entire strategy. It was a calculated formula designed to paralyze an enemy with an impossible choice. To an outsider, it might have looked like a moment of grace. In reality, it was the opening move in a chess match where the Mongols controlled the board, the pieces, and the rules. For those who chose to submit, the promise was survival. They could become vassals of the great Khan, their lives spared in exchange for tribute, troops, and total loyalty. For a city facing down the Mongol horde, whose reputation for leaving nothing but ash and bone preceded them, surrender seemed like the only sane option. And sometimes, it was. Cities that opened their gates without a fight were often left standing, their people absorbed into the ever-expanding empire. But here's the catch: this mercy wasn't a gesture of compassion. It was a strategic calculation. The Mongols were a nomadic people with a relatively small population, so minimizing their own casualties was an obsession. A bloodless victory was the most efficient victory. But the line between a submissive vassal and a target for destruction was razor-thin. Any hint of betrayal or rebellion could instantly revoke their clemency. The initial mercy was really just a probationary period, and failure meant death. For those who chose the second path, resistance, the promise was not just defeat, but total annihilation. This wasn't a bluff. It was policy. When a city decided to fight, it was signing its own death warrant, and the Mongols made sure the execution was a public spectacle for the whole world to see. A city that resisted wasn't an obstacle, it was an example. Its destruction became a bloody advertisement sent to every other city in the region: this is the price of defiance. The Mongol legal code, the yasa, was built on absolute obedience, and resistance was the ultimate crime. After a siege, the Mongol forces would unleash a methodical, systematic slaughter. Chroniclers from the period describe a terrifying pattern: they came, they pillaged, they burned, they slew, and they departed. The massacres were often indiscriminate, with men, women, and children put to the sword. The goal wasn't just to defeat an army, but to erase a population, ensuring no one was left to rebuild, remember, or seek revenge. The fate of the Western Xia kingdom is a chilling example. After betraying a vassal agreement, Genghis Khan is said to have ordered their complete destruction. Some historians argue this was one of the first recorded attempts at genocide. The Tangut people were so thoroughly butchered that their kingdom was effectively wiped from the map, a ghost of a civilization swallowed by the steppe. This reputation for apocalyptic violence became the Mongols' most powerful weapon. It moved faster than their horses, sowing terror long before the first arrow was fired. Rule 2: Weaponized starvation and thirst. For the cities that chose defiance, the first act of Mongol fury wasn't a thunderous charge. It was silence. A terrifying silence that fell as the Mongol army appeared on the horizon, moving not like a chaotic horde, but like a disciplined net that would slowly strangle the life out of its target. This was their second brutal rule, the weaponization of starvation and thirst. Once they arrived, the first order of business was a total, impenetrable blockade. Their legendary mounted archers would seal every road, every path, every secret exit. No food, no water, no reinforcements could get in or out. The city was now an island, cut off from the world and left to slowly eat itself alive. The Mongols would then set up camp at a distance, a constant, visible reminder of the doom that was coming. They even used deception to appear more numerous, ordering soldiers to light multiple fires at night or drag branches to kick up huge dust clouds, creating the illusion of an overwhelming force. The psychological pressure was immense. Next, they went to work on the land itself. They would systematically destroy the surrounding farmland, burning crops to ensure there was nothing left. In some campaigns, they would even go so far as to divert rivers to cut off a city's water supply. This wasn't just a military tactic, it was an assault on the very elements of life. Inside the walls, a horrifying countdown began. Days turned into weeks. Grain stores ran out. Rations were cut again and again. Then, the real horror set in. People ate their horses, then their dogs and cats. When those were gone, they boiled leather from their shoes and shields for a thin broth. Finally, they turned to grass, leaves, and rats. Persian historians described a descent into madness, where society dissolved under the pressure of hunger. Desperation led to the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. The psychological toll of this slow decay was devastating. Hope withered. The defenders, weakened by hunger and disease, could barely stand, let alone fight. The city became a living tomb, haunted by the patient Mongol army just beyond the walls. This strategy was a deliberate calculation. Why waste Mongol lives storming a fortified wall when time and hunger could do the work for them? While they waited, their captive engineers built a formidable arsenal of siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. Then, they would add another layer of terror, catapulting the corpses of diseased animals and even human bodies over the walls to spread plague and sickness. When the final assault finally came, it was against a city that was already defeated. The weaponization of starvation was Mongol strategy in its purest form, patient, ruthless, and psychologically devastating. Rule 3, the human shield, turning your people against you. Of all the brutal tactics in the Mongol arsenal, perhaps none was as psychologically cruel as the use of human shields. This wasn't a desperate move made in the heat of battle, it was a horrifyingly common feature of their siege warfare, designed to shatter an enemy's morale by forcing them to kill their own people. The process began long before a major siege. As Mongol armies swept through the countryside, they rounded up the populations of smaller towns and villages. Men, women, and children, these captured civilians, called the Hazhar, were force-marched to the next target. When the army arrived at the gates of a great city like Samarkand, this terrified mass of people was driven to the very front of the Mongol lines. Now, the defenders on the walls faced an impossible choice. The first wave of the assault wasn't Mongol warriors, but their own countrymen, neighbors, maybe even their own relatives. They were forced to advance, sometimes carrying ladders or materials to fill the city's defensive moat. So what do? Hold your fire. If you do, you allow this human tide to advance, giving the real Mongol army a risk-free path to your walls. Open fire. You end up slaughtering your own people. This was psychological warfare at its most depraved. It was designed to paralyze defenders with horror. How could you fire an arrow into a crowd of women and children from your own land? That hesitation was exactly what the Mongols counted on. And if the defenders did fire, the psychological impact was catastrophic. The screams of their own people, killed by their own hands, would shatter morale. It turned the very act of defense into an act of self-mutilation. The Hazar were also forced to perform the most dangerous jobs of the siege. They filled moats, dug under walls, and absorbed the first volleys of arrows, all to save the lives of valuable Mongol soldiers. Their fate was almost always death. If the defenders didn't kill them, their Mongol captors often did once their usefulness was over. In some cases, the survivors of a conquered city were forced to become the human shields for the next siege, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of horror. This rule shows the Mongols' utterly ruthless view of warfare. They saw no honor in battle, only victory. Human life, especially that of their enemies, was just another resource to be used and thrown away. Rule 4: The spectacle of cruelty, executions as psychological warfare. The Mongol Empire was built on a theater of terror, and its most dramatic performances were public executions. This was the fourth brutal rule: punishment wasn't just retribution, it was a broadcast. The Mongols developed a repertoire of gruesome and symbolic execution methods, each designed to send a powerful message of what happens when you cross the Khan. One of the most infamous methods was reserved for aristocrats and rival leaders. Mongol tradition considered it taboo to spill noble blood onto the earth. But this didn't lead to mercy. It led to creative cruelty. After the Battle of the Kalka River, a group of captured Rus princes were laid on the ground, and a heavy wooden platform was placed on top of them. The Mongol generals then held their victory feast on that platform, eating and drinking as the princes below were slowly crushed to death. The horror was multifaceted. It was a slow, agonizing death. It was the ultimate humiliation, turning powerful rulers into the foundation for their conqueror's party. And by not spilling their blood, the Mongols followed their own taboo while sending a message of total dominance. They weren't just killing their enemies, they were literally feasting on their demise. The story of that feast spread like wildfire, paralyzing future resistance. For crimes like treason, the punishment was just as symbolic. The Yasa demanded absolute loyalty. A governor who surrendered and then rebelled might be tied to a horse and dragged across the rough steppe until his body was torn to pieces. The mutilated remains were then left unburied as a warning. Even mass executions after a siege were part of this theater. At the city of Nishapur, after a massacre of horrific proportions, the slaughter was reportedly followed by a chillingly precise act. Chroniclers of the time described how soldiers were ordered to build enormous, grotesque pyramids from the severed heads of the victims. These skull pyramids were not just a gruesome way to clean up. They were monuments of terror. They were billboards advertising the price of Mongol wrath, left standing for any traveler to see. The message was unmistakable and needed no translation: this is what happens when you defy the Khan. These weren't just random acts of violence, this was a calculated policy intended to break the spirit of entire nations. Rule 5: The annihilation of bloodlines. The final and perhaps most insidious rule was the widespread use of mass rape as a tool of conquest and domination. While a sword could destroy an army, the Mongols understood that to truly conquer a people, you had to attack their future. You had to sever their bloodlines and humiliate their men by seizing control of their women. This was the ultimate act of domination, a brutal strategy that left a legacy written not just in history, but in the DNA of Asia itself. The process was chillingly methodical. After a resisting city was conquered and its male population largely killed, the women were rounded up and treated as spoils of war. Commanders would conduct a sorting, where women were ranked by their beauty, age, and social status. The most desirable, often the wives and daughters of nobles, were reserved for Genghis Khan or his top generals. The rest were distributed among the soldiers as a reward. This was not just about satisfying lust, it was a policy of forced assimilation. The children born from these assaults would have Mongol fathers. They would be raised within the Mongol sphere, cut off from their maternal heritage, language, and culture. A generation could be born with no connection to its past, effectively erasing a people's identity and replacing it with one loyal to the empire. The psychological impact was devastating. For the men who survived, it was a symbol of their ultimate failure to protect their families. For the women, it was a living nightmare of sexual slavery. The scale of this practice was staggering. A landmark 2003 genetics study revealed that an astonishing 8% of men in a vast region of Asia, from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, share a nearly identical Y chromosome. That's about 16 million men today who are direct-line descendants of a single man who lived about 1,000 years ago. Researchers traced this lineage directly back to Genghis Khan and his family. This isn't just a coincidence, it's the stark, scientific evidence of a policy of mass sexual conquest practiced across a continent for generations. This final rule reveals the terrifying depth of Mongol strategy. They waged war on every level, military, psychological, and biological. The conquest wasn't over when a city's walls fell. It was over when its identity was shattered and its future was rewritten in the image of the conqueror. These 5 rules represent a system of warfare so brutal it built the largest land empire in history. From the calculated choice of surrender or die to the mass violation of entire peoples, every tactic was designed to break not just bodies, but the human spirit. Which of these tactics shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more of the dark truths of history, make sure to like and subscribe. The armies of Genghis Khan were far more than just brilliant horsemen. They were a weaponized system of terror, built on a foundation of 5 brutal, interlocking rules. They presented an illusion of mercy that was really a choice between subjugation and annihilation. They rotted cities from the inside out with weaponized starvation. They used the horrifying tactic of human shields, turning people against themselves. They made executions a public spectacle of cruelty. And finally, they systematically assaulted bloodlines to erase their enemies from existence. Together, these rules created a reputation for apocalyptic violence that often won the war before the first soldier ever appeared on the horizon. It was a doctrine of total war, waged not just on battlefields, but in the minds of their enemies. The legacy of Genghis Khan is not just one of empire, but of a chillingly effective blueprint for how to use fear and brutality to bring the world to its knees. This was how fear conquered the world.